I'm Matthew Boulay, I'm the director here. And about a year and a half ago, one of the very first directors of Salem Art Association, Nancy Lindbergh, who's an artist, many of you probably know her, came into my office with a sort of a newspaper thick catalog of classes that Salem Art offered in the 70s. And she said, you guys got to get back to offering classes. Lectures, art history, studio classes. And, we all thought, great idea. How do we start this? And you really want to start with somebody who's easy to work with, fun, engaging, and knows their stuff. And so I thought of Phil and reached out. All of us have, I think, a memory of a special teacher in middle school or high school or elementary school who sort of touched us and shaped our direction. Well, Phil's been teaching at Sprague for 20 plus years. And I know he is that teacher for many Sprague students and former Sprague students because they come to me and tell me that. They'll visit the galleries and we'll start talking and I'll say, oh, you went to Sprague, did you study with, and they're like, Mr. Nickel? And I'm like, do you mean Philip? I don't know. But anyway, this is the first of 2 lectures that Philip will be doing. The second is exactly 4 weeks from tonight, May 14th? Does that sound right? Okay. And you can also register for that. And then we'll be launching many more in the months to come. So Philip will take questions, and I'm excited. I've been hearing about this as it's been developed. So I'm super excited. Please welcome Mr. Nickel.
I wish my class did that every day. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. When I was asked to do this, it was like there were a variety of topics we could choose, and I wanted to do something, not knowing exactly who the audience would be, but that might be able to resonate in a 2-part kind of talk. And so I thought about some things that I'm really interested in as a historian and as an art historian, is that the way in which identity can be shaped and molded and repeated, and ultimately how those things get sort of inculcated into our ideas and perceptions of the time and the people and leaders in particular. So the 2 parts of this. The first part is going to be about power and authority and the different ways in which that's conveyed through art. The second one is the sort of the reverse, which is how do we fight against those received identities, to resist power and authority, to fight against power and authority in artistic ways, to redefine ourselves, our time, our society. And so think of this as part 1 of 2 as we look at this. So that's the goal. I'm used to having an overhead projector. It's kind of like my Linus blanket a little bit. It's like one of these archaic, people laugh at me for having it, but it's always been sort of that thing I have there to put my notes on, and also I've got a stand over here, but I may or may not get over there. We'll see. So I want to go through a variety of things with you about power and authority, and looking at different ways in which power can be conveyed. I mean, the first and obvious one is clearly bigger is more powerful. Right? The size of something indicates power, and so that's a kind of an easy one to think about. But there are other ways in which power can be conveyed. First one comes to mind is the connection between the human and the divine, and that the divine instills in people power to do whatever it is that they're doing. The gods, or God has said, I get to do this. Other ways we convey power and authority might be through narrative. We tell stories, right? But history is story. And the artworks we look at tell a story. And so we want to look at the stories that they construct for us and how that story is maybe truthful or maybe more mythological as it is. I think the last thing to look at, maybe the last 2 things, are first off, how do we remember the past? The idea of like the past is a thing that we use to define ourselves. And so when we create works of art that remember the past, how exactly do we remember the past? And it's a question of the how do we remember something and convey that something. And typically, when we talk about the past, it's used sometimes as a tool, but sometimes as a weapon. And so we want to look at that. And I think ultimately, the last way in which we use this is just how do we depict people? How do you show a person? In this case, for this lecture, it'll be about people who are powerful. The next lecture will look at people maybe who didn't have as much power, but are fighting against that construct of power. So that's the plan. Any questions? If you need to ask questions, feel free. I'm used to people raising their hand and asking questions. So we'll go on with that. But I'm going to run through a bunch of, like a survey, just a survey of different examples of these things with you. We're going to start with some examples from the Near East, farther back in time, ancient Near East, and move toward, get pretty close to the present in some of these. This is the Stele of Hammurabi. Some of you will know this. I always joke that this is the thing that students remember from being in 6th grade. Because I remember learning about this in 6th grade, which is learning about ancient civilizations. We learned about the Code of Hammurabi, which this is our first written code of laws. And it's interesting because in this case, the code is written down below. This is a 7-foot basalt stele that is in the loom. The code is down below, but above is this image over here of these two figures. And this is obviously the variety of interpretations of this, because it is at this point now some 4,000 years old almost. But we have on the right-hand side the god Shemesh, who is seated. He's wearing a headpiece here to indicate his position's power. This is Hammurabi, and we think this is Hammurabi being in the presence of the god. And the god is in essence giving him authority. So here's Hammurabi, he's demonstrating his piety. He's got his Near Eastern arch, a bare shoulder was a way of demonstrating piety to demonstrate piety to the public, to the gods. But if Shemesh is giving him the power, the authority to rule, then he's connected himself to the gods. And in fact, Shemesh, this is the first example we have of the personification of gods. So we're seeing him in human form. In this case, probably in terms of scale, some people have interpreted the things at the bottom to be like mountains and hills, and so technically it would be much bigger than Hammurabi would. This is good because if you go against the law, you're not just going against the state, you're going against the gods. And this is something we're going to see throughout history as rulers associate themselves with gods as a means of creating a further authority for their power. Okay. Likewise, this period here, this is the one of the many ziggurats you might know of in this area of the Near East. But this is a fairly small one, but it's a very old one. This is the White Temple on top of the ziggurat that's here. The ziggurat was only about 40 feet tall. It wasn't really a super big one like the Tower of Babel would be. But this one, in essence, elevated the temple above everything else because of a very horizontal landscape here. And so having the temple on top elevates it up toward the gods and all. And it's visible from a long distance away. And it's whitewashed, so it stands out in this environment. And one of the things about that is that if you see this from a long distance and you see the temple and all, one of the things you know right away is how powerful the ruler is. Because he had to make the ziggurat itself, which means he had to compel labor. He had to force labor to do this. And so it demonstrates his ability to do that. It indicates the ability of that society to expend labor in that way, as opposed to for other things. And so just the mere presence of this indicates how powerful that particular city would be. The other interesting thing is that you have this sacred space, the precinct on top here. That's an exclusive place. Not everybody gets to go there. And so when you create an exclusion, Okay? You create a sense of an other, that there are people who are in this space, but others are not in this space. You differentiate those people. And obviously the ruler and the priest could be in this space. So we're looking at different ways in which these sacred spaces can be used to convey power. Still in the Near East, this is the Palace at Persepolis. Persepolis is in present-day Iran, and Persepolis was this palace was built by Darius and Xerxes, two of the Persian leaders, and they were about the same time as Greece in about the 4th century BC. So the Palace at Persepolis was constructed as a means of conveying ideas about the authority of the Persian rulers. It's a very large space. It's the Apadana, which is the main audience hall, was about 200 feet by 200 feet. It was very, very large. You would enter, you would come down this walkway, this pathway. There were several of them that converged on Persepolis. You'd come down this large walkway and you would go through these large gates with the Lamassu at the gates. Lamassu is a human-headed winged bull. That's a guardian image. It's meant to be intimidating and powerful. And you go through that. This is called the Gate of All Nations. And the reason for that is that this is the map of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire extended all the way over into Egypt, northward up to this area here in Turkey, and eastward all the way to India. And so it's a very large empire. Back in, when we're talking about the 3rd century, 4th century BC, we're talking about how do you manage a place that's that big? Okay? Without modern telecommunication, the structure of this had to be one that was built on local governors, making sure that everybody was participating. So, if you notice this, like you've got various areas indicated on the map: Phrygia, Cappadocia, Armenia. When you come there, this is part of the Apadana, the reconstruction drawing of the Apadana. These columns are bigger than anything that people knew of. At this time, these would be the tallest columns in this region of the world for sure. The capital alone, you can see the scale, get a good sense of scale of this capital to get a sense of how big this is. So when you come to this place, you are overwhelmed by size. You are small as you are inside the Apadana. And that's the first thing that the ruler wants you to feel. He wants you to feel small. And then the next thing he wants you to do is know what your place is. Okay? So why are you here? What are you doing here? And as you come in, as you walk up, you walk to the Apadana's elevated on a platform. You come there and you're walking up the stairway there. You're greeted by all of these friezes. And these friezes show all of the conquered peoples. And all of the conquered peoples are there bringing tribute. These are the Armenians bringing their tribute, their horses. According to some accounts, the Armenians provided 20,000 horses to Darius. So here the Armenians are coming. We can recognize them through their clothing, their hair typically, and they're bringing the things that area was known for tribute. And so you see this group coming. You go to the next group, you see the Scythians here with their very distinct hats on, bringing their tributes, cloth here. We come here, we have the Parthians bringing their tribute, the Lydians with their tribute, okay, as well. And so the Syrians with their tribute. So it reinforces this idea that, okay, I can see myself in one of these groups. I mean, maybe I'm in the Syrian delegation. I'm showing up here. This is demonstrating what everybody's supposed to be doing. Why are you here? You're bringing tribute. And everybody else in the empire is doing this too. And that's how the empire is able to effectively reinforce that idea of each conquered peoples. This is your expectation. Every year you're supposed to be providing tribute to the emperor. And so you see yourself, and you see your group in this. And this is just a sample. There are many more because there are so many other groups within the Persian Empire at this point. Okay. Questions so far? Okay. All right. Let's stick with some of the way in which size matters and how religion impacts all this. This is Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is the Church of Holy Wisdom in present-day Istanbul. This is built by Justinian I, the Byzantine emperor. And he's building this in the beginning of the 6th century, okay, the first third of the 6th century, as a means of demonstrating his power. This is the largest vaulted structure in the world, okay, in the 6th century. What they figured out to do is how to set a dome on top of other domes, So you can see the half dome here and some other domes in the corner here, to create a very large vaulted space. We're talking about a space that is 270 feet in length. Okay? So the nave area would extend that far. So this is an extremely large building. When you go into it, this is what it looks like on the inside. And all of the yellow that you're seeing up here and here and all, that would have been gold. Okay? So imagine the effect. And the effect when you walk in. The dome itself up here is set on these very small clear-story windows, but there's so many of them up there that the feeling is that the light is reflected off of that dome. It's hard to see the breaks between each of the windows. And then you add in the fact that the Byzantine church is very much part of sort of mysticism as part of a practice of worship. So there's lots of incense burning. You get that going up there, you get the light filtering through it. And it creates this very dramatic scene. And one of the things that they did was, if you were a visiting dignitary, ambassador from some group, the first thing they did was they took you to Mass. Before you got to meet with the emperor, you had to go to Mass. So they take you into a building bigger than anything you've ever been in. And this is your first impression. So the emperor, when you meet the emperor, you know exactly where you stand. He's able to have a place like this. You don't. Okay? You don't. Justinian is doing this in the aftermath of the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise in the east of the Byzantine Empire. And so this is Justinian, when he builds this, the Byzantine Empire is at its sort of zenith, its pinnacle at that point. And it's demonstrating that to visitors, to the world, where the Mediterranean world stands right now. Being in Constantinople, that is the center of the Mediterranean world because of its power. Rome, although having the claim to certain religious centrality, the Pope in Rome being there, the Pope in Rome at this point is somewhat weak because of the strength of Constantinople. The economic center of the former Roman Empire shifted to Constantinople by this point. Very decidedly so, probably centuries actually before the construction of Hagia Sophia. Interestingly, if you notice in the image here, you can see the minarets here. Those are added after 1453. And 1453 is when the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople. And you can see here there's some medallions with Quranic scripture inscribed on them. What's interesting is you take over a group and you have to go through that process of, anything you can do, I can do better. And so, a few centuries later, the Muslims come in 1453. By early 1600, they've constructed what's called the Blue Mosque, just adjacent. It's not quite as big, but it's a far more elegant structure. The Hagia Sophia tends to be very thick wall, very heavy, very grounded. Blue Mosque is much more elegant in its spires and its buttresing and its domes. So, but it's definitely having a conversation here between the two, saying, you could do that, so we've taken over your society, and we're able to do what we did. So, speaking of places, some of you just had this afternoon as part of the lecture this afternoon. The palace at Versailles is a way of also the ruler, in this case Louis XIV, to flex some of his political power. And I'm going to focus on a couple of things with this, mainly having to do with the ideas of how do we convey power. So you have to recognize that this what used to be a hunting lodge, and at the beginning of the 1600s, this was a hunting lodge. But by the time Louis becomes the emperor, he's got designs to make this into something grander. So he's moving out of the Louvre and creating a new palace out in the woods. And so that's what Versailles is. Versailles is his new palace that is built outside of Paris, about a day's ride outside of Paris at the time. So he builds this lavish palace and moves there, which now means that everybody else has to move there. All the lords, all the nobles, they need to move there because they need to be at court. If you're not at court, you've got problems. And so you have to move out there. Well, moving, if you're an aristocrat, means like moving and building a fancy place to stay and hiring staff and making sure you've got, all of the things you need to be like an aristocrat. That was very expensive. It did this thing. It pulled the aristocrats away from Paris, so they're away from the people. And it took their money, essentially, because they had spent so much money, so they couldn't undermine them. Louis is going to rule for a long time. He's a monarch that rules for a very long time. And because he managed to keep the aristocrats at court and spending the money in court, they didn't have money to undermine him. So he was able to hold on to power that way. But some of the other things about this as well, if you notice the gardens here are very manicured, right? And it's about power and control. What better way to show your power and control than I can make nature do what I want? So they manicured the grounds, they put trees in boxes, and what better way to show that you've got power to control nature than to box a tree? But eventually the tree probably wins that fight, but you've done it to at this point. But even beyond that, even the whole of the grounds, even the forest out here, when you look at it from the air, it's crisscrossed by paths, it's all under control. He has brought all of this under his control. So he shows his power in this way. It's the same thing when you see like an equestrian statue, or like the famous painting of Napoleon, crossing at Austerlitz up on his horse, which he never actually did. He's riding an animal, which demonstrates control of nature. In addition, though, one of the most famous areas of this is the Hall of Mirrors. If you've ever been to Versailles, you definitely know the Hall of Mirrors. But this room, this space, you're coming down the hall, here's his throne. It's obviously lavish, it's obviously rich and all. But here's the thing, those mirrors, nobody's ever seen mirrors like this at this time, okay? The idea of how do you make a mirror? How do you make a mirror's been around for millennia. You took up the black basalt rock, you polished it, you can see the reflection, sort of like the Vietnam Memorial. But what we have now is the ability to adhere metal to glass. And that process, probably developed in Germany, had been taken over by the Venetians. The Venetians were the only ones making mirrors until Louis came along. Louis convinced some of those Venetians to come up to Paris to teach some Parisian workers how to make these mirrors, which they did, and then he opened up a giant mirror-making factory there in Paris, just for him. Just for him to do this all along there. Any one of these squares would have been a fortune back then. And their walls are covered in them. The great advantage to getting the metal to adhere to the glass is that they don't tarnish. So you can have this beautiful reflective quality to the mirror, and they'll last. And so this is what he's done here. He's created this. So you walk into this space, sort of like the Houdon, you're in a space that you've never seen this before. You've never seen this many mirrors in your life before. And suddenly you're surrounded by mirrors like this. And it creates this sense of awe, but it also flexes his ability to say, yeah, the Venetians had that, now I've got it. Okay. So different ways in which he's utilizing this space. What do you notice about this?
Stands out in the landscape.
It's
the biggest thing around.
It does. I mean, this is a wheat field. Here's Chartres Cathedral. It dominates the landscape. Right? This is in the 20th century. It's dominating the landscape. Think about it when it was made, when it was built in the 11th and 12th centuries. It's dominating the landscape even today. It's kind of an optical illusion. I'm going to tell you it's an optical illusion. The horizon line is actually halfway up the church. But that said, it's still halfway up the church. There's a whole city there. There's a whole city around it. I didn't Photoshop it. That's the way it is. But those buildings, even these buildings that are several stories tall, don't come up to that height. So in the landscape, you can see this cathedral from a long distance. But this is one of my favorite buildings, actually, because of what it's doing, what it's conveying to us. This is all about change. This is all about the power, a power that's changing in Europe. The centers of power for the church are shifting at this point. Once we get to this time period, after the 11th century, the structure of power is shifting from monasteries, which tended to be very rural, to cities. We see a change in Europe of growing urbanization. That's brought on by the ability to create more food, there's more people, as people drift to the cities. Now let's see this concentration of people in those cities that represented money. That money can be tapped into to make cathedrals like this. Giant soaring Gothic cathedrals. People would participate in fundraisers, right? We're familiar with fundraisers, right? You ever had a child knock on your door saying, hey, would you like to buy some, wrapping paper? We're fundraising for this cause, whatever it is. But they would fundraise for this, and they would have the people would don, aristocrats would don sackcloth for a day and come out and pull a cart of stones to show that they were doing their part. They would raise money for this. And the cathedral here actually has been, it's been a sacred site going all the way back to the Romans. Okay? So there's something here for the Romans. There's a Carolingian church coming into the 9th century. In the 11th century, they built a Romanesque church there. Then in the beginning of the 12th century, they built this church as it started, and there's a fire, and they rebuild it again. Each of those times having to fundraise for the church. So the power of the church is shifting to these urban centers. But it's interesting about this too, to continue that idea of shifting power, is that the source of education in Europe had typically been reserved to the clergy in these monasteries. And now we're seeing the rise of new schools, cathedral schools, the rise of universities associated with cathedrals. So bishops now, the bishops have the power. The abbots in the monasteries, they used to have the power. They don't have the power anymore. And so there's a fundamental shift in, we see in education. The cathedral school at Chartres, very famous cathedral school led by a guy named Thierry of Chartres, demonstrates this for us. And when you look at the front portal here, this is the main portal here, you see the changing role that Mary plays as well. You see a shift in our concentration of on Mary from being sort of a background figure now to being a very active figure. She is now obviously Queen of Heaven, She's powerfully enthroned here, Jesus on her lap here. This over here is the main, the right-hand portal on the westwards. Mary's enthroned here. She's in both. This is the first time we've actually seen Mary as the subject matter of a temperament before to a church. So Mary's got this new role. So the cult of Mary, the cult of the Virgin, is expanding during this time of the Middle Ages. But Mary's also got another role, and she's been made the patron saint of the humanities. So going along with the idea of schools, now teaching humanities was the core curriculum of colleges and universities during this time period. All around this are now the personification of the humanities, paired with their classical embodiment. So you have Ptolemy, you have right triangles, Pythagoras. But these are classical embodiments. Those are pagans. Those are pagan figures on this church. So the reason for that is that we have her now as the embodiment of humanities, reinforcing the ideas of learning in that capacity. And the rise, the beginning, now this is still, we're talking like, this was completed in, I think, 1140, so this was completed. The rise of new learning that was being received in Europe because of the Crusades. We see the Crusaders beginning their crusade in 1095, bringing back with them ideas that have been preserved in Muslim sources in the Middle East. And so there's a new fascination starting to grow with these texts that they were bringing back. And so schools were looking at those things. And so we have a broadening of our a subject matter, if you will, in this case. How am I doing? We good? Any questions? I'm just going to do a short digression, one minute. It's this one. Do you know the Colosseum? Do you know the Colosseum? Do you know what the real name of the Colosseum is?
Oh my
It's the Flavian Amphitheater. We call it the Colosseum because the form is a Colosseum. But the actual name of this specific one is the Flavian Amphitheater. It's named for the Flavian family. The Flavian family, they produced a number of the Caesars during this time period. Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian were the three Flavian emperors at this time. And they ruled, but they built this Colosseum. Now, why would they build a Colosseum? Why would they just, build something that seems more triumphant, or maybe something that's more powerful? Well, for the Romans, there are a couple of things going on here. The first one is that the belief in the idea of civic virtue meant that you did things for the populace. And so to demonstrate how good they were as rulers, to show how good they are, they built something for the public's entertainment. And so they built this amazing structure. It really is amazing. It seated about 50,000 people. When it opened, they sealed up the floor and flooded it so they could sail ships on it. And they reenacted a naval battle for the opening ceremonies. That's pretty cool. Right? But they get to put their name on it. Just like all across the United States now, every arena has somebody's name on it. Companies, people, right? So the idea of having an arena where we have these activities taking place with naming rights to indicate, to signal to people who's doing their, it's trying to be more than just advertising. I think I know they think of it as advertising, but like I'm doing something good, associating themselves with this. I don't know how the Trailblazers doing. I don't know if they're making the playoffs this year or not, so maybe it wasn't such a good idea. So speaking of Romans, one of the ways in which we actually see this is we remember the past by building monuments, memorials to things. This is the Arch of Titus in Rome. The Arch of Titus, again, one of those rulers from the Flavian family, This arch commemorates his sack of Jerusalem. Now in 70 AD, Titus wasn't emperor yet, but he was sent to go and put down a rebellion. And he goes to Jerusalem and destroys the temple in Jerusalem, completely tears it down, kills everybody that was in it. But as the Romans tell that story, it's much more about like, look what we've done, triumphantly returning with the golden menorah and other elements, other artifacts from the sack of that temple. And so the Romans had, as you know, had a tendency to commemorate their military victories with these triumphal arches. You find them not just in Rome, but you find them in other cities around Europe where the Romans were who built these triumphal arches. My favorite one, though, is this one, the Arch of Constantine. Constantine needed to signal his power. He needed to signal his power and authority in a really bad way. See, Constantine was not supposed to be the ruler. He was, the empire had some issues. And so under Diocletian, the empire was split into two halves, an eastern half and a western half. And each side had a sort of a Caesar and an Augustus, so a president and vice president, so to speak, on each side. So the east side you had Caesar and Augustus, on the west side you had Caesar and Augustus. And the idea was to create a system of succession. The Romans had succession problems. Let's just remember. They had a lot of succession problems. Constantine is off. He's actually up in Britain when word reaches him that there's a job opening, let's say. And his men hear about this job opening, and they acclaim him to be the new emperor. And that's in 306. Constantine sends some notifications to people and says, hey, by the way, I've been elected the new emperor. Now, not everybody went along with that. In fact, there was a guy in Rome, eventually his name is going to be in Rome. His name was Maxentius. And Maxentius, he was like, no, I'm in Rome, so I am that guy. Constantine takes his time. He moves from Britain down to the city of Trier, where he had sort of his home base there. He gathers people together. He does sort of magnanimous kinds of actions there to get the populace there on his side. He builds his army up. And then in 312, he marches on Rome. In 312, he arrives at sort of the boundaries of Rome, and Maxentius is going to go out and meet him in battle. This is going to be the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine wins, as you might have guessed, because he's got the triumphal arch. He wins, and he comes to Rome in 312, and he's acclaiming himself as the emperor. Now, he has to start acting like the emperor. So he has to start doing things that the emperor does. And one of the first things he does is he starts building projects. One of which is to take Maxentius's basilica and finish it off and rename it under his own name, because he gets naming rights now that he's the emperor. And instead, in addition, he goes and starts building a triumphal arch at the public's expense, paid for by the public because the Senate went along with it. The Senate said, yes, we want to spend money this way. Yes, we do know the rubber stamping it, but they do this anyway. So here is his triumphal arch, much bigger than Titus's. It's just actually just some kitty corner from Titus's there. But this triumphal arch now does this other thing to convey power. What he does is he takes from 4 other emperors sculptures and reliefs from their basilicas, their fora, and puts them on his. And the reason he does this is so that we understand that there's a connection between these emperors and him. Because he chose 4 good emperors. Okay, Marcus Aurelius, let's see, I'm trying to remember all of them. Hadrian, the Trajan, I'm trying to remember the fourth ones, but those are at least the three. So all good emperors, all supposedly good emperors. They were good for the empire, and so he's associating himself with them. And part of the reason he does that also is because he wants to get this thing done, so people can see that yes, he is the emperor. And so there's visually, if you ever look at it, there's a lot of difference between some of the iconography on this because of the different times in which they were done and the different artists who did it. But he's associating himself with good rulers. We see this actually in other things where you want to associate yourself with somebody who is a good ruler. In the Pantheon in Rome, they do this. The inscription on the Pantheon is not for the person who actually built the Pantheon. It's for a good ruler, to a good ruler who was there before him. And so associating himself with earlier rulers and good rulers gives you credibility. So, as you might be thinking, there are lots of other. This is an image of Constantine delivering money to people. What's Constantine going to do for us? Well, here he is, handing out money. You want your ruler to be, like your ruler? It's going to give you money. I don't know if you ever did. Now this goes, there's obviously many translations, but this is probably the one that we all sort of think, oh, I know where that's going. The Amphitheater in Paris here, built by, initiated by Napoleon, but not finished by Napoleon, but initiated by Napoleon to commemorate the troops who died in the Napoleonic Wars and in the French Revolution. But based on the ideas of the triumphal arches in Rome, but this one's obviously much bigger. Yeah.
Was it an entrance through a wall, or was it purely ceremonial?
So we go back here. These are, especially the Arch of Titus, is on the Via Sacra, which is the main avenue going up to into Rome, sort of into downtown Rome back in the day. And people would process through this arch. It was less a gate than it was a monument in the road there. All right, so I'm going to move on to a couple of different forms of art here real quick. This is a way of telling a story. Diego Velázquez was the court artist to the King of Spain. The King of Spain wanted him to tell some stories for him. And he commissioned Velázquez to paint quite a number of paintings. The Surrender of Breda is very interesting in terms of what it says to us. This was completed and hung in the king's audience hall in his palace. And there were, I'm trying to remember the name of the room, but it was a name of the room, sort of like, they all gave all nations, sort of like the story of our conquest. The Surrender of Breda is a story about the town of Breda, which is actually up in what is today the Netherlands. But back in the time, this was part of the Spanish holding. Spain actually was the ruler, Philip was the ruler of Spain at the time. It was also the ruler of this area. It's called the Spanish Netherlands. That composed the area today of Belgium and the Netherlands itself. At this point, though, the northern southern provinces of the Netherlands, of the Spanish Netherlands, broke away. They'd been infiltrated, if you will, by Calvinists in particular, and they had rebelled against Spanish control, Spanish Catholic control. And so a rebellion broke out. Spain sent their men there, and they're going to fight for quite a number of years over this. Ultimately, in this case here, Breda is going to surrender to the Spanish. So the Spanish over here, everybody's, you notice that all of their lances are all in neat formation. Everybody looks good and happy and hale and all. But the over here, the Dutch, they look a bit ragged. The person here who is the sort of mayor of Breda is stooping down, handing him the key to the city. Please surrender. They might have been a little bit premature in painting this. First off, this didn't happen quite this way. The Spanish got pretty beat up in this battle. They definitely did not come out of it looking all nice and neat. And then just a couple years later, the Dutch come back and take it. So it's nice that he has this painting on the wall showing the surrender of Greta, but most people who saw it would probably have known that, well, it wasn't part of the Spanish holdings anymore.
Did the artist paint himself in that painting?
He did. There's Velasquez right here. Yes. And he's looking out at us. Never actually having been to Greta or anything like that, but he puts his face there. Yeah.
I assume this was a large painting.
This is a fairly large scale painting. Yeah, I don't even know the exact dimensions, but Velasquez was working on a very large scale. You see, so there's obviously some signaling in here. You get the cross in the background of the water. Here you can see the burning of the town behind it. And all. Speaking of telling stories, this is a great room to visit in the Louvre, by the way. Nobody's there. Very few people out there. But once you know the story, you can't get enough of this room. Marie de Medici was a young woman, and she became betrothed to the King of France. You kind of scratch your head and go like, how? The Medicis were they're just from the city of Florence. They were kings. How in the world did they get their daughter betrothed to the King of France, Henry? Well, it turns out that the Medici make all their money in banking. They're the European loan sharks. And they're very careful about that because usury was a sin. But somehow the Medici seemed to get around that by loaning out lots of money. They loaned a lot of money to Henry so he could go fight some wars. Well, those wars went okay. In the end, he's very much in debt. And so they said, you know what? We'll write off some of that debt if you marry our daughter. So Marie de Medici is going to marry the king. One of the interesting things at this time is that these kinds of arranged marriages among the aristocratic classes, not just among the royalty, but among aristocratic classes, was often done with paintings. They would create a portrait of the person and send it to them, to sort of see what they look like. Okay? Kind of a fascinating little thing that was going on with stuff. So here is the portrait of Marie de Medici being delivered to the King of France, Henry over here, as part of that process. Here's what our daughter looks like. Now, the story here is interesting because Marie de Medici marries Henry, and then because she marries him, a few years later, she is ascended to be the queen. Now, it doesn't happen immediately when they get married. It doesn't mean that just because he got married to her that she became queen. It did take a few years. So, she is going to be crowned queen. Then a funny thing happens. Henry's assassinated the next day. Now, I swear there should be a story about this, but most historians believe that those events are completely unrelated. Although I'd like to imagine that they were related. But he died, he's killed the very next day. So she is going to become the ruler of France. Okay? She goes from being Medici's daughter to being the Queen of France. She's going to rule in her son's name, okay? Because her son was not of age yet, so she's going to be the regent for him. Eventually, though, he grows up. We've actually heard this story a couple of other times in history where the mother rules in the son's name, and then eventually the son's like, hey, Mom, can it be my turn? Can I have a turn now? I'm actually of age. Can I rule now? Well, she wasn't really keen on giving that up. And ultimately what ends up happening is they have a little civil war. And aristocrats backing Marie fight the aristocrats backing her son, and they fight, and he wins. And as a result of this, Marie is sent into exile to a chateau in the Loire Valley. Let's be real. Exile for the queen is hardly a prison. So she's sent away for a number of years. And after a few years of being, horribly, horribly treated by being outside of Paris in the chateau, sends a note to her son and says, look, I'm really sorry about what happened between us. Can you forgive me? And he says, I can forgive you. You may come back to Paris. Just don't cause me trouble. Okay? So she moves back to Paris, where she is going to get the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. So if you've ever been to Luxembourg Gardens, there's a palace that's next to it there. She gets to have the Luxembourg Palace. And the first thing she does is she wants to rehabilitate her reputation. She wants people to think very highly of her. So she hires the biggest name in painting in the Northern Europe, a guy named Peter Paul Rubens. And she said, she hires him, brings him to Paris, because he's up in the Netherlands, actually in the Spanish Netherlands. Comes down to Paris and she's like, I need you to paint me a whole series of paintings, okay, 23 big canvases. We're talking like massive size canvases, like each of these canvases is like 15 feet tall. She's going to paint a lot of this. She says, I want you to tell my story. You're going to create a biography of me. This presented a little bit of a problem for Peter Paul Rubens simply because, despite the fact that this sounds like a lot of really great intrigue had gone on, her life really is kind of like constrained, right? You're constrained both as a woman and as the queen in many ways. So he has to take some liberties with things. If you notice in the scene here, this particular scene, we have her being presented. She looks out at us. She's the icon in this picture. Henry, for his part, very fascinating. I actually love this touch. Rubens was, when he's really thinking about this stuff, he's really brilliant about what he's done. For Henry, if you look at that hand, his left hand, it's a little touch. He's got like this. He sees the painting and he's like, wow. And here's the personification of France behind him, whispering to him, yeah, this is the one, this is the one I want. We have Cupid here, pointing in, yeah. So, and down below, if you look, I should get my laser pointer back. You can see that in the background we have some cities burning there. That's reminding us of the wars that got Henry in trouble. And here the cherubs are playing with all of his armor that he's taken off. And so the story is sort of saying, like, okay, this is going to be good for him. This is going to be good for him. We'll get him to forget about fighting, forget about wars. He gets married to Marie. All will be good. She had these paintings done, and in the entrance hall to the Luxembourg Palace, you come into this hall, and you've got to walk down the whole hallway with all of these paintings on one sides. You've got to look at all of the ways in which she's trying to describe her life. And they're fascinating studies. Some of them are just are funny in ways, and some of them are really telling. Like, what is she trying to message to us? And all the time she's trying to message that she was good. If you get a chance, I do think it's a great place to visit. Oh yeah, here's you can see the hand gesture here, and things burning in the background here. It's a very adorable kind of piece. But she's telling us a story to reinvigorate her position at court in Paris there, and it works to some degree. She does accumulate some allies there. She ends up causing problems, not unsurprisingly, and ends up having to leave France in the end. But this is the hall. And while you're fighting the crowds to get to see the Mona Lisa, this is a much more enjoyable way to spend a little bit of time is to be in the presence of all of these particular paintings. Just real briefly, this is her coronation, and you can see Henry up here sort of looking on and approvingly at the coronation. And paired right next to it is what ends up happening the next day, which is the death of Henry and the proclamation of the regency. In other words, she's proclaimed to be the regent for her son, and so here she is, graciously accepting from France the right to rule. It's a PR campaign. We couldn't make this as a PR campaign. So, and there's a lot to break down symbolically here. But it's all about trying to tell a story to rehabilitate her in the public's eye. Speaking about needing rehabilitation, Napoleon. I mean, Napoleon, Jacques-Louis David is actually probably, certainly my top 5 favorite artists. It could be like number 1 in terms of what he said. I really love, I almost thought I should do just a monograph talk on David, maybe something like that. What's fascinating about this one is that it's a complete lie. Okay? Napoleon, it's something that's true, but when Napoleon decided to be emperor, and that story is also one of seizing power and intrigue at court. When he becomes ruler, he calls the Pope and says, "Hey, I need you to come up to Paris. I'm going to be crowned emperor." And the Pope comes. He's like, "Oh, this is right. We've got a new agreement. The French Revolution did a real job on church-state relations." Okay. But Napoleon has kind of worked things out. The Pope is coming up there thinking, "Yeah, this is going to be good." He's recognizing my position. I will be there to do the traditional thing of putting the crown on Napoleon's head and using my scepter to indicate that he's the right to rule. And he gets up there and Napoleon said, "Yeah, you can sit there." And then Napoleon went over and take the crown and put it on his own head. He had David paint the Pope sitting right next to him here as he's crowning Josephine. And the Pope has his hand raised in this blessing to show that the Pope actually blessed this thing. It may not have actually happened. The real lie, though, is his mom. Here's his mom, Napoleon's mom. Napoleon's mom refused to come to his inauguration, or his coronation. She just said, "I'm not going to come. You and your brother, you're fighting. I'm sick and tired of you and your brother fighting. You work it out with your brother, or I'm not coming to your coronation." And she didn't come. Thankfully, David put her in the scene so we know that she's there. So this painting, other than those kinds of stories, is all about like showing how much support Napoleon has. He has the, if you look at this, it's divided into groups. We've seen this before. Justinian actually did this in Ravenna with his work too. But we have the aristocracy over here. We have the military over here. We have the clergy right here. Everybody's gathered around Napoleon. Everybody supports Napoleon at this point. And so, indeed, this scene which takes place in Notre Dame in Paris is a scene of the coming to power of Napoleon at this point. And the way he came to power does have a lot of like steps along the way of like, well, let's just be out. 3 of us will be councils, and it's like, well, we'll all be 3 councils, but I'll be the first council. You guys can be second and third councils. And then also it's like, I don't need 2 other councils. I'll just be the 1 council, and then I have to be emperor. David was also very excellent at PR. He's going to survive the French Revolution with his head intact, still attached to his body, which is actually quite surprising. He was very close to losing it at one point. And then he goes on to become the painter for Napoleon. And like I said, it's very much a PR campaign. I actually don't know how I'm doing my time. What time is it?
7:04-ish.
Anybody need to go? If you need to go, it's okay. We want to finish, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of statues and we'll end up. Creating an identity for yourself. Statues are a good way of talking about identity. One of the stories from ancient Egypt is the story of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is she's a female pharaoh. It's almost unheard of. There are a few of them, but you can basically count them on one hand. She's probably the most powerful of them. She was married to a guy named Thutmose II. And Thutmose II died. And so, not unsurprisingly, her stepson should be the pharaoh, but he was really young. So she said, I'm going to rule in your name for a while, as a regent. And that goes on for a couple of years, and then suddenly something changes. The images of Hatshepsut start shifting. She starts wearing a beard. She's got a headdress on, the Neme's headdress, that is the symbol of being the pharaoh. In the statue, okay, she's depicted as a man. The inscriptions all identify her as Hatshepsut, a woman, but the images are a man. She's trying to show herself as a pharaoh, in which she was. She was actually a really good pharaoh. During her time period, Egypt had peace, it economically expanded. She built some of the major architectural works, particularly at Karnak, were under her reign. But she's trying to show, because to be a female pharaoh, that's really standing out at this point. So she had to do these things to demonstrate her power. Here she's offering much. She's offering order to society. She's making an offering to the gods, saying, I bring peace and order to Egyptian society. She's being pious. Again, sort of going back to that idea of demonstrating piety to the viewers. So Hatshepsut is changing herself to give herself a position in society. Augustus, Caesar Augustus. He looks good, doesn't he? Yeah. This is Augustus the Primoporta. Augustus the Primoporta is kind of interesting because up until Augustus, the usual view of somebody who is a Roman of high stature looked like this. This is the bust of a Roman patrician. This is a thing we call verism, that the idea of telling the truth about a person. And so all of the wrinkles, all of the scars, all of the worry in the brow, that shows experience, that shows having lived, that you are a wise person because of all this. So that's how you should be shown, until you get to Augustus. Now Augustus says, well, I'm the emperor. This is back when we had the republic. But the emperor, he needs to be perfect, he needs to be ideal. So Augustus, he's 60 years old, by the way. So he's looking pretty good. Augustus himself, if you notice it, he's missing some stuff. He's the emperor, he's the ruler. Let's see a helmet, let's see a sword. It's almost, other than the ceremonial breastplate that he's wearing, there's nothing to really indicate power in the sense of military might. He's carrying a fasces here, a rod that is a symbol of power, that I have authority. And he's showing leadership. He's leading the way in this way. So he's idealized, he's perfect. On his breastplate, he's showing a story that he's doing that good thing for society. He fought a group called the Parthians. And the Parthians had fought against the Romans a number of years earlier and had defeated the Roman army in that battle. And as a result, had taken the Roman standards away from them, which is pretty humiliating in that time. So Augustus sent his troops over Parthia to take back those standards, and he succeeded. So he's fulfilling that civic virtue that I'm doing this for the people again. But at the same time, because he's emperor, something else shifted. He needed to be divine. He needs to be divine. At least in their thinking, he needs to be divine. So they devised a story whereby his father, Julius Caesar, is adopted by Venus. And because he's adopted by Venus, then his son, Augustus, therefore must be divine. And so this is where we start getting the cult of the emperor, the idea of the divinity of the emperor. And it begins here. And the sculptor put it in as a really cute little touch. He put a little baby Cupid here, reaching up, grabbing onto the bottom of his cloak there, his dress, to indicate the connection between Venus and Augustus. We must not think immortal our Augustus is this poem that was written by Ovid at this time to celebrate divinity of Augustus now, and how that came about. And speaking of other movies, George Washington. It makes it look small there, but to give you a sense of this is life size. Okay? George Washington was 6 feet 2 inches tall. It's not bad to know that, actually, because the average height of an American man at this point in the colonies was 5'4". So 6'2", you are towering above people. Right? This particular statue was commissioned by the Virginia legislature. It was commissioned in a time period between the end of the Revolutionary War and the beginning of the United States of America. It's an interregnum between those two, which we call the period of the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution of the United States isn't adopted until 1789. The war ends in 1783. So we've got this little period of time, during which, I almost said Napoleon, Washington returned to Mount Vernon in Virginia. And the legislature decided to celebrate Washington. So they commissioned the guy by the name of Jean-Antoine Houdon, a French sculptor, to make this likeness of Washington. And I always very much enjoyed this one, because it contrasts so beautifully with Augustus. Okay? Augustus, this idealized figure, military, kind of similar to breastplate, etc. But here's Washington. What do you notice about Washington?
He looks pretty chill.
Yeah.
Punch and all.
It's pretty what?
Punch and all.
Punch and all. If you notice this, yeah, absolutely. Right? He's definitely, okay? He's not idealized, is he?
No military accoutrements.
No military accoutrements, except for right here, he's taken off his sword and he's hung it up. And he hung it up on top of what looks like a column here.
That's the fashion.
But those are the fashions, yes. There's 13 of those rods bound together. See the bindings here, separated by arrows. So obviously the 13 for the 13 colonies. But that's Washington's bound the nation together and has come to retire. In Rome, there was a military ruler by the name of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a great Roman general. And he won this major victory for Rome, and the people acclaimed him emperor. They wanted him to be the emperor. And he turned it down. And he said, I'm going back to my farm. And he went back to his farm. And this was seen as good because it showed that Cincinnatus was a good person, because he didn't fight the battle for his own glory. He fought it for the Republic and then went away. He didn't take something from that victory. And that's the same thing Washington was doing. Washington's going back to Mount Vernon. At this point, he's not president. This is before he's president by a couple of years. And although there were people at that point who were willing to acclaim him king, there were actually voices saying we should make Washington our new king. But he goes back. And what Houdon has done is he's captured those elements of the plow in the back here, showing him as the farmer, the sword hung up here, and you can see the rods here, the arrows. But there's this one great little touch that Houdon added to this. It's this wonderful little thing. I love the little things that like the hand of Henry. Houdon did this thing. Washington's a great man, but he's missing a button. He's just like you and me. He's an ordinary guy. This isn't to be aggrandized. Okay? This is Washington as Washington was. People knew the guy, right? He's hanging around. They put a statue over the guy. They're like, hey, George, that's a nice statue. Right? If it doesn't look like him, they're going to be questioning him. Remember, we're trying to found not an empire, not an autocratic monarchy. We're trying to found a democracy. So we need a Cincinnatus. Last image. A few years later, in the 1830s, after most people who had forgotten, or not forgotten, but who had passed on, who didn't actually know Washington personally, he becomes a bit mythologized. And the country decides they want to do something for him. So they commission a guy by the name of Greenough to do a sculpture of Washington. Greenough produces a sculpture of Washington like none other, and he presented it at the Capitol building. They know it's coming. This is the statue of our first president of the United States.
Where did that one?
That just makes me uncomfortable on so many levels. It's larger than life. Considerably, you can see here. Today, you can go to Washington D.C. You can see the Smithsonian. I don't remember which of the Smithsonians it's in, but it was in the rotunda at the Capitol for a little while. People were appalled by it, absolutely despised it. They moved it outside for a while, hence the picture here, and then ultimately the Smithsonian took it inside. So our leaders, how we see our leaders, and how they are as leaders, sometimes can vary with time. So I'll pause there. I'll stop there because I can keep going. I like talking about this stuff, don't I? Any questions?
How many of these things have you seen in person?
How many of these things have I seen in person? Let's see. I haven't seen George in person. No. I have to go back and check. I've seen this in person. That's at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. This is in the Louvre. I've seen that. I've seen this obviously. So I'd say the majority of the works of art that are sculpture or paintings I've seen. I've been to Hagia Sophia, but I haven't been to the Near East to see any of the Near Eastern sites. So I have seen this too at Hammurabi.
Isn't that the Greenough statue look a lot like Zeus?
It is. It's actually modeled on a story of a Greek statue of Zeus. That's what it's supposed to be exactly.
Good God, so to speak.
Yes. I mean, I don't even see my president shirtless. So yeah, I think he made the little children.
Was the scandal that people strongly disapproved of because he was partially naked?
Yeah. The 1830s in the United States were in sort of the midst of the Second Great Awakening. There's a religious fervor that's gripped the country. Greenough was trying to aggrandize, mythologize Washington, and people were just like, okay, first off, no, and secondly, not that way. And so it was roundly criticized at the time.
Thank goodness.
I also like this one. I didn't get to talk about this one. I like this comparison of Napoleon to. Again, I like it because of the comparison to Washington. Here's Napoleon, more real than what we have over here as well. So I'm going to stop because I'll and we'll get out of here tonight. So thank you very much for being here. And in 4 weeks, we'll do this again. Hopefully, we'll be here, and we'll talk about resistance to power and authority, and the way we sort of redefine identity using art to do that. So, got a few Cindy Sherman works to engage with. Thank you.